In this video, I'll provide an overview of the material that's in Chapter 9 of your textbook. By all accounts, this is the most important chapter in our textbook. It brings all the material from the earlier part of the course together and allows us to have a comprehensive model to talk about what we call general equilibrium, or equilibrium in all the markets at one time in the overall economy. It provides us with a tool, a model, to be able to explain what's going on in the economy, to be able to understand the news and what's happening there in terms of economic activity in the economy, to make forecasts about future economic activity. So this is really a critical chapter in our book and in the course. Let me share the screen and we'll take a journey through the chapter section by section. The introduction to Chapter 9 provides a really useful overview of what the model is about. This model called ISLM, ADAS. IS is for the desired investment, desired saving in the goods market. LM has to do with liquidity in the money supply, in other words, the asset market. So it's the goods and asset market equilibrium together. And IS and LM, those two together, make up what aggregate demand, the part of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So they're not exactly identical. They're useful and similar and derived from each other models. They're not different models, but they highlight different things. ISLM model has prices in the background, has real interest rates front and center. The aggregate demand, aggregate supply model has the price level front and center and interest rates kind of in the background. So it depends what we want to focus on, and but we can use either model, both models, to explain the economy, make predictions about the economy, carry out analysis of macroeconomic policies, fiscal and monetary policy. And we can use the two models to talk about both a Keynesian approach to macroeconomics or a classical approach to economics. The models are rich enough to be able to use both kinds of viewpoints to analyze macroeconomic activity. The main difference between those two, if you go back to Chapter 1, is that the notion of price and wage rigidity and assumptions about that. Classical economists believe that prices and wages adjust quickly. And in that case, we get a particular kind of outcome in the economy. The economy moves back to full employment relatively quickly, and nothing is needed to move the economy back to full employment. The Keynesian model assumes price and wage rigidity. Prices and wages don't adjust quickly. In that case, the economy can be out of equilibrium for long periods of time, usually point to the Great Depression. That's what John Maynard Keynes was really responding to at the time, back in the 1940s. In that kind of model, what we see is that we get different kinds of outcomes for how the economy operates and how long the economy might be away from potential GDP and full employment equilibrium. In that case, as Keynes suggested, there might be room and might be a desire to have the government or the monetary authority, the Federal Reserve in the United States, carry out policy to try and help the economy move back to full employment and potential real GDP more quickly. So all of that's covered. I really suggest that you take a look at this introduction, even before section 9.1. It'll give you a good overview. Section 9.1, the first part of the chapter, is fairly simple and very short. It just says, here's the line that represents full employment, the FE line. And where does that come from? It comes from our production function that we learned about in Chapter 3, and the labor market. In equilibrium, the labor market, labor demand, labor supply determine the equilibrium level of employment, and the equilibrium level of employment determines the equilibrium and full employment level of real GDP, or Y bar in this graph. So it's separate from all the other markets in the economy. You can kind of think of it by itself. And so things that shift that FE line have to do with either the labor market, labor demand, labor supply, or changes in the production function. So very short section. And you'll see, let me go back actually and scroll down. You will see that in each one of these sections, there is a summary box, factors that shift a particular line, the full employment line, the IS curve, the LM curve, the aggregate demand curve, the short run aggregate supply curve. You will see these boxes. These are really critical boxes to understand. And you should pay particular attention to these because, right, the question that we ask in the course is something happens in the economy. We ask the question, well, which market is affected? Which curve in that market in the graph in our graphical model? And which way is the curve shifting? And then what are the implications for that in terms of the different variables in the economy? We're going to be doing the same thing in this chapter, talking about IS and LM, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, the full employment line, and asking, so which curve, which way, what happens? Another thing I want you to keep in mind in this chapter is that these curves are derived from the earlier chapters. Just as the FE line here that we're talking about comes from the material in chapter 3, labor demand, labor supply, the production function, right? The LM and IS curves come from the money market and goods market respectively. And so anything that shifts the IS or LM or FE shifts at least one of those curves in those other markets. And so you should be able to trace it back, not just the graphs in this chapter, but you should be able to trace it back through the underlying markets. That's why this chapter is so important. We need to be able to carry it all the way through. It really is cumulative as the course is, and this is where everything comes together in this chapter. So the second section in the chapter, slip here, okay. Let's get back to 9.2, there we go. It has to do with how the IS curve is derived. Again, it's desired investment, desired saving, that's the I and the S together, IS curve. So it talks about equilibrium in the goods market and shows the relationship between real GDP and the real interest rate. And that's what the IS curve is and how that relates to the underlying goods market, desired investment, desired saving. So these sections are about how the curves get derived. This first part of the section gets into, this is the different points on the IS curve correspond to different levels of GDP and the equilibrium real interest rate in the goods market at those different levels of real GDP. Things that shift in desired investment or desired saving that don't have to do with real output are things that are going to shift the IS curve, either up or down. In other words, things that are going to either increase the equilibrium real interest rate in the goods market for a given level of real GDP or reduce the equilibrium real interest rate in the goods market for a given level of real GDP. So we start out by deriving the curve itself and understanding where it comes from, and then to be able to talk about, well, what actually shifts that curve. All right, so that's the second part of this section. Things that shift the IS curve have to do with things that have to do with either desired saving or desired investment, right? These wealth, government purchases, taxes have to do with saving, desired saving in the economy. The last two here have to do with desired investment, right? So it's important to understand what those curves, something that shifts those curves and how that relates to shifts in the IS curve. And so here's an example, in this case, an increase in government purchases that reduces national saving. It increases the real equilibrium interest rate for a given level of real GDP, higher equilibrium real interest rate, that's a point on a new IS curve. And so you want to pay close attention to these parts of the chapter that deal with shifts in the curves as well. There's always a linkage back to the underlying market. You need to be able to understand that. This is the place where it happens first, and then it has implications for shifts in the IS curve. So there are other examples that you could use from that summary table. Changes in any of those variables will shift the IS curve, and I encourage you to do that and to convince yourself of what happens in terms of the IS curve when there's a change in one of those factors that shifts either desired saving or shifts desired investment in the goods market. The next section of the chapter deals with the asset market, right? Liquidity has to do with the demand for money, right? The demand for liquidity, demand for money, that's what the L is, right? And M stands for the money supply, right? So liquidity and money demand, money supply, right? Asset market equilibrium, that's the LM curve. So we do the same kind of analysis here. You can recall that from this last exam, I suggested that you look at section 9.3, this section in chapter 9, because it's directly related to the material that we talked about in chapter 7. And there was no curve, or sorry, no graph of money demand and money supply, although the discussion was there in words. So we can go deeper into this and talk about that. And there exactly is that graph of money demand, money supply. You would have seen that in the videos that I have for chapter 7. But it was that graph actually isn't introduced in that chapter. It's here in chapter 9.3, or introduced graphically anyway. So again, the first part of this section is how do we actually get an LM curve, right? So the question is different levels of real GDP. What happens to the equilibrium real interest rate? In this case, in the money market or asset market, when real GDP changes, money demand changes, and that, in this case, an increase in real GDP would cause a higher equilibrium real interest rate in the money market, and A and C therefore represent different equilibrium points in the money market for different levels of real GDP. And again, just like in the goods market, we're going to flip that question around now and say, okay, for a given level of real GDP, what things could cause the equilibrium interest rate to rise or fall in the asset market, the money market? And those will be things that shift the LM curve. For example, a change in the money supply brought about by the Federal Reserve to carry out monetary policy, right, for a given level of real GDP. So money demand isn't shifting then, money supply would be shifting, right? And if an increase in the money supply would shift the money supply curve to the right. It would reduce, in that case, the equilibrium real interest rate. And that would cause a downward shift in the LM curve, right? Because there'd be a lower level of lower level of the equilibrium real interest rate for that given level of GDP, right? Sorry about that. Come back out of that, right? So you can actually, in your book, you can enlarge those graphs for yourself, just in the same way that I just did. Right? And there's video that's useful to look at how the LM curve comes about as well, right? In addition to the ones that you have from me in Blackboard. So again, it's about deriving the curve, right? And that's why I was asking you to look at this, not for the LM curve itself, but to talk about money demand and money supply back in chapter 7. So that's how that comes into play. We've got another section here about things that shift the LM curve. Again, there are summary tables. Again, those are really important. As we said, if there's an increase in the money supply, that shifts the LM curve down and to the right. And here's the reasoning behind that. You should make sure you understand that for each one of these, how these things play out in the asset market, the money market, how the equilibrium real interest rate changes, and what that means for shifting the LM curve. Okay. So those are the reasons that are given here to the right, but you should make sure that you really understand that, because ultimately, again, it's going to be understanding which things shift the LM and IS curves or the FE curve, and then how the economy responds to that, but then also what's going on in the asset market and goods market underneath that, to be able to explain that. Right? So changing the real money supply. This is the one we were just talking about before. Changing the real money supply, lower real equilibrium real interest rate for a given level of GDP, real GDP, right? Y equals 4,000, and that reduces the equilibrium real interest rate in the money market, shifts the LM curve down and to the right. So you're able to do that for each one of the items that's in that summary table. And again, there's a video with the text explaining how the LM curve is derived and what causes it to shift. Then we finally put all this together, right? The full employment line, the LM curve, the IS curve, all in one graph, right? So this represents general equilibrium in the economy. That point E on this graph represents general equilibrium in the economy. At that point, any point, here's the way to think about this, right? As these bullet items up here mention, any point on this LM curve, the asset market is in equilibrium. Any point on the IS curve, the goods market is in equilibrium. Remember, it's the equilibrium level of real interest at any level of GDP, right? And then the full employment line represents equilibrium in the labor market. So the only place where all these markets are in equilibrium together, or what we call general equilibrium, is where they cross, right? Because at that point E, we're on the IS curve, we're on the LM curve, we're on the FE curve, and if each one of those curves represents equilibrium in the relevant underlying market, that's the place where all the markets are in equilibrium. Now, the next thing related to this is say, if all three curves don't cross at one point, let's say that IS curve had shifted out to the right, right? And in that case, IS and LM curve can be in equilibrium, but they're not crossing on the full employment line. Well, in that case, there's going to be an adjustment that takes place that will naturally bring the economy back to equilibrium. That's the theory, right? And what's going to happen is the price level is going to do the adjusting. The question is, how quickly does the price level change to bring about equilibrium back at full employment? That's the real question, right? Does it happen quickly? That's the classical model. Does it not happen very quickly? Are prices sticky, rigid? That's the Keynesian model. Right? That's as easy as it gets. So there are going to be natural forces that bring us back to full employment. The question is, how long does it take? If it takes a long time, then it might be useful to have the government or the Federal Reserve involved in the economy to move the economy, try to get the economy back to full employment, because otherwise there could be inflation or there could be high unemployment. High unemployment historically has been the one we've been concerned about more often, but there are times when high inflation has been the bigger problem as well. In the 1970s, for example, that was the case. So this is bringing all these markets together, literally, right? And then there's an example here about how do we actually use this model? It's always going to be about something causing a shift in a curve. In this case, it's a negative supply shock to the economy, a temporary supply shock. So something that reduces the full employment level of output. In that case, the full employment line is going to be here. So IS and LM, this is another important point, where the IS and LM cross is always the place that we would talk about actual real GDP. So actual real GDP could be more or less or equal to full employment GDP, which is that Y bar. If the economy is not at full employment, right? If the actual real GDP is different from the full employment or potential level of real GDP, the theory suggests and indicates that the price level will adjust. The overall price level in the economy will adjust to bring about equilibrium at full employment again. How long? That depends. It could be the case if you're a classical economist, you believe that that happens relatively quickly. If you're a Keynesian economist, then you might say, well, that doesn't happen very quickly at all. And in the short run, there may be negative consequences for the economy. Therefore, the government or the Federal Reserve should be involved in trying to get the economy back to full employment rather than wait for it to happen on its own. So we can go through this example, right? Talk about oil price shocks back in 2008. That was the case also back in the 1970s, a long time ago. And there's a useful box here talking about how econometric models are used. You'll take Introduction to Econometrics, or you may be in it currently in that course, and how that works, how those models work for the economy. Okay. Yeah, as it says here, many of these economists, many of the models used are some version are of the kind of model that we have here graphically in this chapter and in this book. All right. So the next part of this talks about how do we get back to general equilibrium. General equilibrium just means where all the markets are in equilibrium together. The economy is at full employment, goods market and asset market are in equilibrium, and all those equilibrium points are crossing at the same place in terms of the ISLM and FE curves. As I said before, that the thing that does the adjusting to bring us back to full employment is the price levels. We talk about price adjustment in how we get to full employment. So that is this is a critical piece of the discussion, critical piece of the model as well, right? And helps explain in real life how the economy tends to move back to full employment on its own. Question is, how long does it take for that to happen? Right? And so there's some additional information in there about money growth, monetary policy, how that can influence real GDP, or in this case, how it can really affect inflation. Right? So we finally have, as part of our discussion of changes in the price level, changes in inflation, right, which is a new variable for us in our model. And then we can talk about the ISLM model through the lens of classical versus Keynesian understanding of how the economy works, Keynesian classical assumptions, and those have to do with how quickly the price level adjusts, actually wages, nominal wages, and the overall price level in the economy. We can think about it in terms of the adjustment of the price level. Again, that is the key difference between Keynesian and classical economists. And so classical economists would talk about, for example, monetary neutrality, that changes in the money supply, which shift the LM curve, which could move the economy away from full employment. If it pushes it beyond full employment level of real GDP, it's likely to simply cause inflation. Right? This is where the notion that there's a close relationship between the money supply and inflation in an economy comes about. Right? So that's one area of monetary neutrality, talking about the differences between Keynesian and classical economists. And then in this section of chapter 9, 9.6, right, the last section of this chapter is just bringing the ISLM and FE model, right, together in a different way, right, to put the price level right front and center in the axis, on the axes, rather than having that be part of the discussion as we just did in the last section here about price level adjustments, being in the background and talking through that, right? So in this case, using aggregate demand, aggregate supply, using this ISLM FE model, but modifying it somewhat, talk about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, is actually really useful to talking about changes in the price level, inflation, changes in real GDP. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply is the model that you learned about in the Principles of Macroeconomics course. That is what is typically discussed in that principles level course. And now you can see that that model comes from ISLM FE model, comes from these underlying markets, the asset market, the labor market, and the goods market, and they all come together. And we just talk about it in principles level course in terms of the final outcome, in terms of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Whereas in this course, in intermediate macroeconomics, we want to look at the underlying markets as well as the overall aggregate model. So aggregate demand comes directly from ISLM. So aggregate demand, we follow the same process we did earlier in the chapter. Aggregate demand, how do we derive the aggregate demand curve? You ask the question at different levels of real GDP, what happens to the price level, or at different price levels, really in this case, that's the way to think about it. At different price levels, what's the equilibrium level of real GDP in the economy from IS and LM together? All right, so in this case, if the price level is, you could think about either as going up or down, but let's start here at point E, right? And the price level goes from P1 to P2. P1 is lower than P2. Price level goes up. What happens to the equilibrium level of real GDP in the economy according to the ISLM model? Well, the LM curve is going to shift up and to the left if the price level increases. And as that happens, the equilibrium level of real GDP goes down. And so we get this relationship. This ENF corresponds to this ENF up above. And again, we're going to do the same thing and ask, what are the things then that shift aggregate demand? The quick answer to that is anything that shifts IS or LM, right, separate from changes in the price level, right? Because changes in the price level are a move along aggregate demand. Changes in anything else that shift IS or LM change the equilibrium level of real GDP in the economy for a given price level, right? Those are the things that are going to shift aggregate demand to the right and to the left. That's the way to think about that. The equilibrium level of real GDP, what happens to that, right? That is measured on the horizontal axis for a given price level. So anything that shifts the IS curve, anything that shifts the LM curve, except for the price level, will shift the aggregate demand curve. That means anything that shifts investment or saving in the goods market will shift the aggregate demand. Anything that shifts the LM curve in the asset market, the money demand or money supply in the asset market will shift the aggregate demand curve, right? So taxes and government spending, changes in technology that affect the marginal productivity of capital, right? Tax policies that might affect investment on the LM side, the Federal Reserve and the money supply in particular, right? Those are things, all those things are going to affect aggregate demand. So factors that shift aggregate demand. This is just a discussion or a pictorial view of what we're just talking about. Anything that shifts IS, government spending increasing, for example, remember, shifts desired saving in the goods market up and to the left, which shifts the IS curve up and to the right, which ultimately shifts aggregate demand to the right. All right. So there's going to be another video about this here in the chapter, but there's also another summary box, as I mentioned. Right? All the things in this summary box have to do either with the desired investment or desired saving in the goods market, all these things on this list, or things that affect money demand or money supply in the money market. These are all things that shift the aggregate demand curve. Aggregate supply curve depends whether we're talking about the long run, right? The long run aggregate supply. In the long run, we believe that prices fully adjust. Whether you're a Keynesian or classical economist, you believe in the long run that prices fully adjust and the economy goes back to full employment. Therefore, longer aggregate supply curve is really just that full employment line that we had before. But instead of the real interest rate being on the vertical axis, we have the price level on the vertical axis. So the price level does not affect the level of real GDP in the long run, right? Only what we call real factors, labor demand, labor supply, changes in the production function. The price level doesn't affect those in our model. That's the stuff from chapter 3. In the short run, Keynes assumed that prices were fixed, right? So long run, prices adjust fully, they're flexible, they adjust fully. In the short run, prices are fixed, they don't adjust at all. And so any movement, so what the assumption is in the Keynesian model is that firms will supply whatever output level that's needed in the economy and will adjust their hiring and employment to do that for whatever the current price level is. That's a horizontal aggregate supply curve in the short run. In reality, and what you learned about in principles of macroeconomics is that the short run aggregate supply curve is really probably an upward sloping curve, so that any change in aggregate demand, this is really where this is all leading to. Do changes in aggregate demand have an impact on the economy? Well, in the long run, it's just a move up the aggregate supply curve. And no, the answer is no, it only affects the price level or inflation. In the short run, like what Keynes was talking about, changes in aggregate demand don't affect the price level, they affect real GDP. In the real world, though, we see that changes in real GDP and changes in the price level both tend to happen together in the short run. And that would suggest an upward sloping supply curve in the short run. So we have these sort of two extremes depending what you believe. This is prices don't adjust at all. This is prices adjust fully and quickly. In between is probably where the real world is. Okay. So here's the equilibrium in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Right. Actually, this is showing the economy out of equilibrium, and what will happen is the short run aggregate supply curve will adjust, the price level will adjust, in other words, to bring about equilibrium in the economy. The story is not any different than with the ISLM model, but the graphical representation is different. Okay. And then finally, there's an example showing what I just mentioned before. Changes in aggregate demand, in this case, caused by an increase in the money supply, monetary policy, right? If prices adjust fairly quickly, then there's ultimately no impact on output in the economy. There is in the short run, not in the long run, right? The question is, how fast do we move from the short run to the long run? Or in other words, how quickly does the price level adjust? That is the key question. So that's really the question, and that's important for you to understand in the Keynesian versus classical view of the economy. You get different answers, right, depending on how quickly the price level adjusts. If prices don't adjust at all, changes in aggregate demand lead to changes in real GDP and changes in employment. If prices adjust quickly, then we move directly up to H, and there's no impact on employment or in terms of full employment output. In the short run, if prices are adjusting slowly, they might not adjust immediately, but over time they may adjust somewhat, and it might take a longer time for prices to fully adjust. So you have some impact on output in the short run, but ultimately not in the long run. The question is, how long is the long run? Keynes had a famous saying, says, in the long run, we're all dead. He was focused on the short run and saying that's where people live, and that's what we need to focus on. This chapter really kind of pulls everything together. As we said, it's useful to look at this chapter summary, make sure that you understand all the points. You can see there are a lot of different points that are made here. But make sure that you can understand the distinction between the classical and the Keynesian model and what that implies for aggregate demand policy. When we talk about policy, macroeconomic policy, we're talking about aggregate demand primarily, right? Changes in taxes, changes in government spending, changes in the money supply from the Federal Reserve. That's fiscal and monetary policy. Those are generally things that affect aggregate demand. Not all fiscal policy changes aggregate demand. You could have changes in government spending that affect not only aggregate demand, but also aggregate supply. If it's spending on, for example, infrastructure, if it's spending on new technology, that sort of thing, that could ultimately shift the production function and shift the longer aggregate supply curve to the right as well. But that is the real question: is what is the role of policy making in the macroeconomy? And the answer to that for economists depends on whether you believe that prices adjust quickly in the economy to bring about equilibrium at full employment, or whether prices adjust slowly. At the end of the day, that's really the question, and that's really the difference between Keynesians and classicals in terms of how they view the world. The interesting thing is, what they said, well, which one is it? Is it do prices adjust slowly, or do they adjust quickly? Unfortunately, the answer to that is yes. It's not definitive, and therefore why we still have different viewpoints by economists about the role of macroeconomic policy in getting the economy back to full employment. So that is the way that you need to think about this chapter. This chapter really pulls everything together. That's why we really are building up to this chapter and can have an aha moment, hopefully, about how all those underlying markets all come together to be able to give us a full understanding of how the economy works. We can analyze in past behavior of the economy. We can make predictions about the future behavior of the macroeconomy in the short run, business cycles, and we can evaluate the impacts of fiscal and monetary policy on things like the real interest rate, employment and output, saving, investment, overall in the economy. So this is a critical chapter. That's why we spend additional time on this chapter. Make sure that you really are going through this chapter carefully, taking lots of notes as you go, making use of all the resources that are available to you.